The listener privacy versus data intelligence battle rages on, with podcasters caught in the crossfire, reminding us of how little ownership we actually have of the relationship with our listeners. Hello and welcome to another Podcast Pontifications with me, Evo Terra. Today's episode was brought to you by the podcast app developers who'd like to remind you that we, the podcasters, are not their client. Instead, we, and the shows we make, are their product. We're going to have a discussion about statistics today, podcast metrics, if you will. You have to make a decision right now, podcaster. Do you want accurate stats? And by accurate, I mean precision accuracy that tells you every single access of your file, and that is tracked down to the minutia, accurate? Or do you want actionable data on how your podcast and your outreach efforts are actually performing? Choose one. Accuracy, which just gives you accurate counting, or actionable, that tells you how everything is working together. Not quite the same thing. Today, Overcast, a privacy-focused and very popular iOS app which I use, at least when my wife and I are traveling to listen to their shared podcast together, Overcast is now blocking the second choice. Overcast is blocking your ability to get actionable data on how your podcast and your outreach efforts are actually performing. Let me explain what I mean by that. Well, actually, before I explain what I mean by that, let me say this. But now, luckily, in the words of the developer, Marco Ahmet, in his own words, he says, quote, I'm going to read this, Overcast is too small for anyone to notice because, quote, Overcast represents something like 2 to 4% of their audience. Let's get into this. Specifically, starting now, if you are looking at your stats from Overcast in your podcast hosting company, you will be fine. You'll be fine because that's okay. It's still going to be accessing the content. However, if you're using services like Chartable or Podsights, and at some point in time in the future, reading into the words written there, maybe even PodTrack, those services will no longer show Overcast accesses. Oh, that's interesting. What's going on here? Well, the issue is the fact that some DNS providers around the geeky internal stuff around the internet, there's ad blocking happening at the DNS level these days. And that is, in some cases, causing problems. A legitimate problem that we certainly need to solve. No question about that. And the play that Marco is putting in play currently is to skip those blocking problems. Services like Chartable and like Podsights and others do what we call prefix URLs, where they grab some information at the requested file download, bounce it through some servers, and ultimately get it down to the podcast hosting company. Marco's found a way to bypass the Chartables and the Podsights of the world. So the file, in theory, should still be downloaded. The listeners using Overcast will not be impeded. Again, that's the intent, from getting their files. They just won't show up in those other more actionable data providers' dashboards. Overcast specifically will not show up in those dashboards. They will just not even appear, like invisible activity. That's the idea. The reason this is happening is because Marco was wanting to block what he considers to be, quote, creepy behavior on the parts of the Chartables and the Podsights. Okay, so what that means for us is, welcome to the arms race. Here we are. What are we going to do? about something like this. We can't really do anything about this. What I guess we could do is we could say, well, fine, we're not going to use those additional services, which we know give us much more actionable insight, much more data that we can get as opposed to just simply a file download, which is bogus anyhow, as I've said many a time. We could do that, but we're not going to do that. I mean, reality is, once you get the rich data, once you get the understanding of how much more information you can get from using services like Chartable and like Podsights and others that might be blocked is the wrong way, might be bypassed during this service, I don't think you're going to want to go back. I know I personally get a lot of value out of both of those services. And my plan is to continue to use the services not because they're creepy. No, they give information beyond the download. There's just only so much data we can get by looking at downloads, and we just have to have more. So really what it means to me is now I have to go update all my clients. I got to tell my clients that, hey, you're using these services because I recommended you use these services because you wanted more actionable, meaningful data about how your podcast and your outreach/marketing efforts are working. You wanted to do that. I recommended that you look at these things. Well, now your stats are going to be impacted. In those dashboards, we will not see the activity from probably the most popular iOS app that's not named Apple Podcast. That's going to be a fun conversation. But it'll be a conversation about accuracy versus actionable intelligence. And of course, we still have the quote-unquote accurate data, not really, at the podcast hosting level on just file downloads, which is not really accurate. So, what are you going to do? I mean, there's probably, again, like I said, not much you can do other than disconnect or probably just bring this conversation up with your podcasting peer group. Send them a link to this episode. See how they feel about it. I suppose there could be an outcry, an uprising, if you will, with podcasters who want this actionable data, who can rail against and say no, and maybe that happens and Marco switches back. Maybe more likely, I guess, that whatever this little trick is that he has to bypass the hops, as he's calling them, that go to these analytics providers back to the host. Maybe that thing stops working because, some things stop working. Things change around the internet as these companies try to find ways to get around that. I don't know. Maybe the analytics providers can provide data to him and say, look, we're not being creepy. Let us back in. I don't know. Welcome to the world of uncertainty in podcasting. But what is certain is this. If you love the content I provide to you, please go to buymeacoffee.com/evoterra and slide a virtual coffee my way. That's always nice. That's it. I shall be back tomorrow with yet another podcast, Pontifications. Cheers.